Can you hurry up? Some of us have actual work to do. The words cut through the late afternoon air at Safeway like a blade, sharp and cruel. Kevin Park, 20 years old, with his employee vest barely buttoned and irritation written across his face, stood tapping his foot as an elderly man struggled to grip grocery bags with a prosthetic arm. The young courtesy clerk had no patience for anyone who slowed down his routine, especially not disabled customers who made his job harder. What Kevin didn't see, what he couldn't possibly understand, was that the metal arm he was watching struggle had once held off enemy combatants in the bloodiest urban battle of the Iraq War. Comment Semper Fi. If you believe our wounded warriors deserve our respect, not our impatience. Marcus Steele. Jefferson was 74 years old, though people often guessed younger when they saw his upright posture and clear eyes. The nickname Steele had stuck with him since his Marine Corps days, first because of his unyielding determination, later because of the prosthetic that had replaced his left arm from just above the elbow. Marcus had lost his arm in 2004, not in Iraq as many assumed, but decades earlier in a training accident during his active duty years. What most people didn't know was that Marcus had re-enlisted after 9/11 despite being in his 50s, despite the prosthetic, because he couldn't sit home while young Marines went to war. The Corps had initially denied him, but Marcus had connections, had proven himself countless times over, and had skills they desperately needed. They'd brought him back as a civilian contractor, then later gave him a direct commission as a warrant officer specializing in logistics and tactical planning. He'd served in Fallujah during the Second Battle in November 2004, coordinating supply lines and evacuation routes while the city burned around him. The tattoo on Marcus's prosthetic arm was a work of art and memory combined. A skilled tattoo artist in San Diego had spent 6 hours carefully inking the design directly onto the carbon fiber and silicone surface. The main image showed the Marine Raiders' insignia, the skull and crossed paddles that represented some of the Corps' most elite warriors. Beneath it, in precise military notation, were coordinates: 33.3483 de Gaussian, 43.7847 de Guyot. Below those numbers, in bold letters, Fallujah 2004. Around the circumference of the prosthetic, names were written in small, careful script. The Marines who hadn't made it home, the brothers Marcus carried with him every day. The tattoo wasn't just decoration, it was a memorial, a testament, a reminder that some sacrifices were written in blood and remembered in ink. Marcus had come to Safeway that Thursday afternoon because he'd run out of the basics: bread, milk, eggs, coffee. At 74, he still lived independently in a small house 3 miles from the store, still drove himself everywhere, still refused to be treated as helpless despite his disability. He'd learned to adapt decades ago, had become so proficient with his prosthetic that most tasks were second nature. But some things remained challenging, particularly when his right hand was occupied and he needed the prosthetic to grip something delicate. Grocery bags fell into that category. The plastic handles could slip from the prosthetic's grip if not positioned correctly, and Marcus had to concentrate to maintain the right pressure. It took him a few extra seconds, maybe 30 at most, but to Marcus, those seconds were just part of life. He'd never considered them an inconvenience to anyone else. Kevin Park had been working as a courtesy clerk at Safeway for 6 months, and he hated every minute of it. He'd taken the job after dropping out of community college, needing money for his car payment and weekend entertainment. He found the work beneath him, the customers annoying, and he developed a bitter attitude that manifested as impatience and occasional rudeness. He was supposed to help customers carry groceries to their cars, bag items efficiently, and maintain a positive attitude. Instead, he did the bare minimum, complained constantly, and made customers feel rushed. His manager had spoken to him twice about his attitude, but Kevin had improved just enough each time to avoid being fired. Today, however, his patience had worn completely thin. Marcus had finished checking out at Register 3, his cart containing 4 bags of groceries. Nothing excessive. The checker, a kind woman named Rosa who knew Marcus by name, had bagged everything carefully, placing heavier items in some bags and lighter items in others to make them easier for Marcus to handle. "You need help out today, Mr. Jefferson?" she'd asked kindly. Marcus had smiled and shaken his head. "I'm good, Rosa. Thank you." He'd pushed his cart toward the exit, planning to load the bags into his truck in the parking lot. Kevin had been standing near the door, supposed to be gathering carts, and had seen Marcus approaching. The sight of the prosthetic arm had immediately triggered Kevin's impatience. He'd dealt with Marcus before and knew the man took a little extra time. Kevin had rolled his eyes and muttered to another employee, "Here we go again." Marcus had stopped his cart just outside the automatic doors and reached for the first bag. His prosthetic hand closed around the plastic handles while his right hand steadied the cart. The grip wasn't quite right, and the bag shifted. Marcus adjusted, his movements careful and practiced, taking perhaps 10 extra seconds to ensure he had a solid hold. Kevin had walked up behind him, his impatience boiling over. "Can you hurry up?" he'd said, his voice loud enough that several people in the parking lot had turned to look. "Some of us have actual work to do." Marcus had glanced at him, surprised by the hostility. "I'm going as fast as I can, son," he'd said quietly. Kevin had huffed. "Well, it's not fast enough. You're blocking the exit." This wasn't true. There was plenty of room for people to pass. Kevin was just being cruel. Marcus had continued carefully transferring bags from the cart to his prosthetic arm, determined not to drop anything. Kevin had grabbed a bag impatiently and shoved it toward Marcus. "Here, just take it and move." The rough handling had caused the bag to tear slightly, and an orange had rolled out onto the pavement. Marcus had bent to pick it up, a process made more difficult by his age and his prosthetic. As he'd straightened, Kevin had made his fatal mistake. "This is ridiculous," he'd said loudly, intentionally projecting his voice so others could hear. "Disabled people slowing everyone down. Maybe shop online if you can't handle the store." The words had hung in the air like poison. Several customers had gasped. Marcus had simply stood there, holding his orange, his face impassive but his eyes showing the hurt that words like that could still inflict even after a lifetime of service and sacrifice. James Holland had been inside the store conducting a routine walkthrough when he'd heard the commotion. As store manager for the past 8 years, James prided himself on running a respectful, customer-focused establishment. He was 46 years old, a former Army medic who'd served 2 tours in Iraq himself, and he had zero tolerance for employees who disrespected customers, especially veterans. James had been in Fallujah in 2004, not during the second battle, but in its aftermath, treating wounded Marines and soldiers who'd survived that hellish week of urban combat. He knew what those men had faced, knew the coordinates of key locations, knew the cost in blood and trauma. As he'd walked quickly toward the exit, he'd seen Kevin standing over an elderly man with a prosthetic arm, that distinctive attitude of arrogant impatience radiating from his posture. James had been about to intervene based solely on Kevin's obvious disrespect when something had caught his eye. The prosthetic arm, clearly visible in the afternoon sunlight, was tattooed. James had done a double-take, his steps slowing as his brain processed what he was seeing. The Marine Raiders insignia, coordinates, the word Fallujah. James had felt his heart skip a beat. He'd moved closer, his eyes fixed on those coordinates, 33.3483 degree N, 43.7847 degree E. He knew those numbers. Every person who'd served in Iraq during that time knew those numbers, or could recognize them instantly. Those were the coordinates for Central Fallujah, the epicenter of the Second Battle, the bloodiest urban combat American forces had faced since the Vietnam War. Over 90 American service members had died in that battle, hundreds more wounded, and thousands of insurgents killed. The city had been hell on earth for a week, and anyone who'd been there carried scars, visible or not. James had walked straight up to Kevin, his voice cold and controlled. "Step away from this customer. Now." Kevin had turned, startled. "I was just trying to help." James had cut him off with a gesture. "My office. Immediately. You're done for the day." Kevin had opened his mouth to argue, but something in James's expression had stopped him. He'd slunk away toward the store entrance, confusion and worry replacing his earlier arrogance. James had turned to Marcus, his entire demeanor changing from authority to respect. "Sir, I'm James Holland, the store manager. I apologize profoundly for my employee's behavior. That was completely unacceptable." Marcus had nodded slowly, still holding his torn bag and rescued orange. "It's all right, son. People don't always understand." But James had noticed the tattoo, had read those coordinates, had seen the names inscribed around the prosthetic. "Sir," he'd said carefully, "were you in Fallujah?" "Second battle, November 2004. Marcus had looked surprised, then had glanced down at his prosthetic as if remembering the tattoo was visible. "Yes," he'd said simply. "I was there." James had felt emotion welling up in his chest. "I was Army medic. I came in right after, helped treat the wounded coming out." He'd paused, his voice thick. "Those coordinates, that battle, what you guys went through." He'd stopped, unable to finish. Marcus had understood. "You saw the aftermath," he'd said quietly. "You know what it cost." James had nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Then he'd noticed something else. Two men in the parking lot, both wearing Marine Corps veteran hats, had stopped and were staring at Marcus's prosthetic, at the tattoo clearly visible in the sunlight. They'd exchanged glances, then had started walking toward Marcus. "Brother," one of them had said, "a man in his 40s with a limp and USMC tattoo on his forearm. Were you really there?" "Fallujah, second battle." Marcus had turned to face them. "Warrant Officer Marcus Jefferson, Logistics and Tactical Coordination. I was there." The two Marines had stood straighter, their expressions shifting to something approaching reverence. "Sir," the younger one had said. He couldn't have been more than 35. "I've read about that battle. My father was there. 1st Battalion, 8th Marines." He said it was hell on earth. Marcus had nodded. It was. A lot of good men didn't come home. The older Marine with the limp had gestured to Marcus's groceries. "Sir, let us help you with those. It would be an honor." Before Marcus could protest, both men had moved to his cart, carefully lifting bags with a gentleness that suggested they understood the weight of what they were doing. They weren't just carrying groceries, they were showing respect to a man who'd stood in hell and helped others survive it. James had watched this unfold, his throat tight with emotion. Another customer, an older woman, had approached and quietly asked what was happening. When James had explained briefly, "That gentleman served in one of the bloodiest battles in Iraq," she'd nodded solemnly and moved aside to let the Marines work. Within moments, a small crowd had gathered, not gawking but standing respectfully at a distance, watching as two younger Marines helped their elder brother. One of them had noticed James's Army veteran pin on his vest. "Army?" he'd asked. "Medic, Iraq, 2005, James had confirmed. The Marine had nodded. "Then you saw what it looked like after?" "You know." James had simply nodded. He knew. He'd spent months treating young men with injuries that would haunt him forever, had held hands of dying soldiers and Marines, had written letters to families he'd never meet. He knew. Kevin had watched from inside the store, peering through the glass, completely confused about what was happening. He'd seen the small gathering, seen the two Marines carrying bags to an old pickup truck in the parking lot, seen James standing with them in what looked like some kind of ceremony. He'd had no context, no understanding. When James had finally returned inside, Kevin had been waiting near the office, hoping to explain himself. James had walked past him without a word, entered his office, and beckoned Kevin to follow. Once inside with the door closed, James had sat down heavily behind his desk, gathering his thoughts. Kevin had stood there, nervous now, his earlier bravado completely gone. "I don't understand what I did wrong," he'd started. "That guy was blocking the exit, and I was trying to help him move." James had held up a hand, stopping him. "That man's name is Marcus Jefferson. He's a Marine Corps veteran who served in the Second Battle of Fallujah in November 2004. Do you know what that battle was?" Kevin had shaken his head. "It was the bloodiest urban combat American forces engaged in during the Iraq War. House-to-house fighting, massive casualties, conditions that most people can't even imagine. Marcus was there, coordinating logistics and supply lines while the city was being torn apart by combat. He helped keep Marines alive by making sure they had ammunition, water, medical supplies, evacuation routes. He did this while rockets and mortars fell around him, while insurgents tried to cut off supply lines, while chaos reigned." James had paused, his voice hardening. "And today, you told him to hurry up because his disability was inconveniencing you. You made a loud, public comment about disabled people slowing everyone down. You humiliated a war veteran who sacrificed more for this country than you can comprehend." Kevin's face had gone pale. "I didn't know." James had cut him off again. "You didn't need to know his service record to treat him with basic human decency. But the fact that you mocked a disabled veteran, a man who earned his injuries in service to all of us, makes it worse." He'd leaned forward. "Kevin, you're fired, effective immediately. This isn't a warning, it's not a suspension. You're done. Collect your things and leave." Kevin had started to protest. "You can't fire me for trying to help a customer." James had stood up, his voice rising. "You weren't helping. You were bullying. You made cruel comments about disabled people in front of other customers. You violated every standard of conduct this store has." He'd pointed to the door. "You're done. Leave now, or I'll have you escorted out." After Kevin had left, James had taken a few minutes to compose himself. He'd then walked back outside, where Marcus was just finishing loading his last bag into his truck, the two Marines standing nearby. "Mr. Jefferson," James had called out. Marcus had turned. "I want you to know that employee has been terminated. His behavior was inexcusable, and it doesn't represent this store or how we feel about veterans." Marcus had waved a hand dismissively. "You didn't have to do that. The boy's young and stupid, but he didn't need to lose his job." James had shaken his head firmly. "Yes, he did. Some lessons are too important not to be severe. He disrespected you, disrespected your service, and showed cruelty to a disabled customer. That's not something I can overlook." The two Marines had nodded in agreement. One of them had extended his hand to Marcus. "Sir, if you ever need help with anything at all, here's my number. Name's David Martinez. I live right here in town. It would be an honor to help a Fallujah veteran." Marcus had taken the card, clearly moved by the gesture. "You boys didn't have to do all this," he'd said, his voice rougher than usual. "Just carried some groceries." The younger Marine had shaken his head. "Sir, it's not about the groceries. It's about showing respect where respect is due. My dad told me about Fallujah, about how the Marines who were there saw things that changed them forever. He said the guys who kept supplies moving, who kept the wounded evacuating, who held the logistics together while combat raged. Those guys were heroes too, even if they didn't carry rifles on the front lines." He gestured to Marcus's prosthetic. "And that tattoo, sir, those names, those are brothers you're carrying. That's sacred." Marcus had looked down at his prosthetic arm, at the names written there, names he read every day. "They were good men," he'd said softly. "Better than me. They deserved to come home." The three younger veterans had stood there in the Safeway parking lot, an impromptu gathering bound by shared service and understanding. James had felt the weight of the moment, the strange brotherhood that connected people who'd seen combat, who understood sacrifice. "Mr. Jefferson," he'd said, "from now on, you shop here. You let me know if you need any help. My direct number is on the store website, or just ask any employee to get me. No more struggling with bags. No more dealing with idiots who don't understand." "Understood?" Marcus had smiled slightly. "I appreciate it, but I can handle my own groceries. Did it for 74 years, can do it a while longer." But there had been warmth in his voice, gratitude for the respect being shown. He'd climbed into his truck, started the engine, and with a wave had driven away, leaving James and the two Marines standing together. David Martinez had turned to James. "Thank you for standing up for him and for firing that kid. Some people need to learn the hard way." James had nodded. "I was a medic. I saw too many good people hurt, too many sacrifices made. I won't tolerate disrespect toward veterans, not in my store." They'd exchanged contact information, a quick bonding between Army and Marine Corps veterans, and then had gone their separate ways. Inside the store, James had gathered his staff for an immediate meeting. He'd explained what had happened, why Kevin was fired, and what would be expected going forward. "We serve a community that includes veterans," he'd said firmly. "Some of them carry visible injuries, some carry invisible ones. All of them deserve our respect and patience. If any of you can't provide that, you need to work somewhere else." The message had been received clearly. Word had spread through the store quickly, and by the end of the day, every employee knew the story of Marcus Jefferson and the tattoo on his prosthetic arm. Marcus continued shopping at that Safeway. Employees greeted him warmly, offered help, which he politely declined most of the time, and treated him with the quiet respect he'd always deserved, but hadn't always received. James made it a point to talk to Marcus whenever he came in, learning more about his service, his life, his family. David Martinez and the other Marine, whose name was Thomas Chen, occasionally ran into Marcus at the store and always stopped to chat, to check in, to maintain that connection forged in the parking lot. Kevin Park found another job at a different store, hopefully having learned something from his firing, though James never checked to find out. What mattered was that Marcus, a man who'd stood in hell and helped others survive it, was finally receiving the treatment he'd always deserved. Not because he demanded it, but because others finally recognized what the tattoo on his prosthetic arm had been saying all along. This is a man who served, who sacrificed, who carried his fallen brothers with him every single day, and who deserved nothing but honor and respect. Subscribe to this channel if you believe our wounded warriors deserve dignity, if you believe service should be honored, not mocked, and if you understand that real heroism is often carried quietly, written in ink on metal, remembered every single day by those who survived to tell the story.